In this part we are going to have a look at the difference of structural and detail brushes, how the engine calculates what it needs to render at any given moment in game, and how we can manually control this entire process by using hint brushes. Let's start by creating a skybox so we have a sealed off area in which we can work. To do this, simply create a huge box to define the outer bounds of your map and assign a texture to the inside faces. In order to load the map in-game, we have to add an info player deathmatch entity which will serve as our player spawn. Alright, since we want to investigate how the engine handles visibility, let's do a standard viscompile and have a first look at the Portal View plugin. Bear with me here, because it's going to look quite colorful and possibly a bit confusing in just a second, but we'll work through it. All those colorful planes that you can see here are created by the compiler to split our map up into smaller sections for which it can then calculate visibility. To get the terminology right, let's refer to the colorful planes as portals and to the smaller sections like this one as leaves. To spare you the technical mumbo jumbo, let's simply remember that the engine calculates visibility by attempting to draw direct lines of sight in between BSP leaves. As soon as a line can be drawn to another leaf, the details of that leaf are rendered. But what does all of that mean for us in practice? Let's go ahead and create a few different scenarios that we can use to investigate all of that. Let's go ahead and create a standard brush that we can use as a ground. In our test, we want to have this ground divided into two parts by a structural wall. In the 2D workspace, we can see that our brush is aligned with the blue portal lines. Alright, so on one side of this structural wall, we want to have the player, and on the other side, we want to have a few detail brushes. By default, all brushes are structural, so we need to go ahead and assign this one to detail. Now we can copy-paste that brush around this little area to simulate detail in various spots. Let's go ahead and duplicate this entire brush composition and create a few different scenarios where we want to test slight alterations of our default scenario in green. For the first one, we want the structural brush to be a bit shorter in height. That way, the wall isn't flush with the blue portal lines as you can see in the 2D workspace. Let's do that again, but this time let's make the brushes a bit narrower at the sides. For the third scenario, we don't want to alter the actual brush dimensions. We'll simply move them around a bit. Alright, so to summarize, we have 4 scenarios where we altered the same brush composition in different aspects. Time to get in game. In order to investigate what the engine renders at any given time, we can use the r_showToReceiver and set that to 2. This enables a wireframe view for everything that the engine renders. For comparison, a value of 1 only shows what the player can see. Let's start by checking the first scenario. You can see that if we stand in front of the structural wall, it blocks visibility to the detail brushes which are therefore not rendered. In this scenario, we simply lower the height of the structural wall a bit. However, we can see that the detail are in fact rendered even though there's a structural wall blocking our view. This one is a bit narrower and you can also see that the detail is rendered. For the last scenario, we didn't change the brush dimensions at all, we just moved them around a bit. Unfortunately, also here, the detail behind the wall is rendered. Why does that happen? Remember earlier when we said that the engine calculates visibility by attempting to draw direct lines of sight in between BSP leaves. As soon as a line can be drawn to another leaf, its details are rendered. Let's have a look at Radiant, and we'll start by enabling the Portal View plugin in the 3D workspace again. Now, this structural wall has the exact dimensions of your default portals, which means from within this leaf we cannot draw a direct line of sight to the other side. For the second scenario, we cannot draw a direct line of sight from down here. However, it doesn't matter from where the engine draws that direct line of sight. From up here, you can in fact see the area behind the structural wall, which is why the detail is rendered. Let's go ahead and have a look at the other scenarios. Here you can see that this BSP leaf stretches all the way to the side, which means we can again draw a direct line of sight to the rear leaf, which in turn means the detail in it is rendered. For our last scenario, we simply move the unchanged brush composition around. You can again see that the BSP leaves extends all the way to over here, from where you can draw a direct line of sight to the rear leaf. This of course is an artificial experiment. In practice, we often don't have the possibility to adjust all structural brushes to match the default portals like in the first scenario. Therefore, we need to find a way to fix these problems. The way to do this is to manually add additional portals where we need them. In this scenario, the problem was that a BSP leaf extends to above the structural wall. To manually add a portal, we simply create a brush with one face along the desired portal plane. That face we are then going to texture with a common hint shader and let the engine do the rest. For the rest of the brush faces, we can simply use common hint skip. We can now see another portal that previously hasn't been there. This portal, as you can see, is flush with the structural wall, which means that now you cannot draw a direct line of sight anymore, because the wall intersects portals on all sides. You can, however, see that the manual portal stops right here. This would mean that within this BSP leaf, we can in fact draw a direct line of sight again, which means, you guessed correctly, the detail would be rendered. This is because the manually created portals only extend to other portals. To fix this, we can simply extend the hint brush to wherever we need it to be. Another quick recompile shows that our extended hint brush works very well now. Let's disable the portal view in the 3D workspace and fix the remaining scenarios as well. The principle here is exactly the same. We need to ensure that the BSP leaves on either side don't extend past our structural wall. In this case, this means that we need to create a vertical portal by adding another hint brush. The last scenario is a bit more complicated because at no side does it adhere to the default portals. Because of that, we have to create manual portals along all of its sides. Now, you can already imagine that this is not the most efficient way to build your map. Remember that we set the engine processes visibility per BSP leaf. This means that the more leaves there are, the more the engine has to process. During compile time, but also in-game when the player moves from one BSP leaf to the other, the game has to process which details it has to render now. Let's have a quick look in-game to see how our scenarios are doing now that we fixed them. For the gray scenario, you can now see that the detail is not being rendered from behind the wall. For the orange and yellow scenarios, you can see that the detail pops into view as soon as we move backwards. This is because we only extended the hint brush all the way to the skybox in the gray scenario. Now, all scenarios are behaving like they are supposed to. We now know the basics of how structural brushes block visibility to detail brushes, what BSP leaves and portals are, and how we can create manual portal cuts to further improve visibility in our map. This was a bit artificial, so let's try and do this in a more realistic example, with two bigger rooms that are connected by a corridor. These rooms we are first going to connect with a straight corridor. Now you can already imagine that this is not going to work out well, because there's nothing to block visibility in between the rooms. But for the sake of the test scenario, we'll start with that anyway. To evaluate visibility, we again need to add detail brushes. We can simply do it the same way we did with the other test scenarios, so there's nothing new here. In the updated portal view, we see that our suspicions were in fact correct. The default portals that you can see in the corridor don't block any visibility because there's no structural brush blocking line of sight. That way, both rooms will be rendered at the same time, which is quite inefficient. There are various ways to build a non-straight corridor, but we are going to use the good old 90-degree corner. The reason for this is that with a 90-degree corner, we can use the inner edge to block visibility. Combined with a hint brush along that inner corner, we can get a maximum effect for visibility. However, right now, the portal placement isn't ideal. The default portals are crisscrossing our corridor, so we end up with several unnecessary portals. To improve this, we are simply going to align our corridor along the default portals. Select your entire corridor and simply move it to the side until you can see the walls match the default portals in the 2D workspace. There we go, a very clean corridor with proper portal placement. However, there is still room for improvement, because the leaves between our portals are still quite large and in some places extend over our inner corners. To make it 100% airtight, we are going to create a vertical hint brush that cuts diagonally through our corridor along the inner edges. That way, the inner edge of the corner is always blocking our line of sight. The rear part of the corridor is only rendered as soon as you cross over into the other leaf. At that time, however, the other 90-degree corner is still blocking line of sight to our second room. We are now left with a perfectly sealed off corridor. For those of you who are as pedantic as I am, we can fix one last tiny issue. You can see that our 45-degree portal is extending way past our corridor walls. Because that creates unnecessary BSP leaves, we are going to change the hint brush into a subtle hint brush. The difference merely is that manual portals using the hint shader extend automatically until they intersect with a default portal. Manual portals using the subtle hint don't extend themselves. That gives you even more in-depth control over visibility, but in turn requires you to pay closer attention when placing them. So from these tests we learned that it is important and helpful to align the structural brushes in your map with the default portals. Of course, this is not always possible, but we can simply use hint brushes to create manual portals to fix possible gaps. When connecting different rooms or areas in your map, remember that a 90-degree corner, along with a diagonal hint brush, is the way to go. Furthermore, for in-detail control, we now also know the difference between hint and subtle hint portals. I hope this was an understandable introduction into how the engine handles visibility, what structural and detail brushes are, and how and when we can place hint brushes.